The Speaker's Game by Michael Sortino. Chapter 1, Crash of the Meteor. G.K. Chesterton was delightfully having the time of his life on his lecture tour of America, and so he quite naturally resented the evil organization that wanted to take it from him. The intersection of Washington Avenue and 9th Street in St. Louis, Missouri was calm and relatively empty that mid-morning, March 19th, in the year 1921, and so his striking figure in black struck 13-year-old Caleb Travers with even greater impact when he saw him leave the cab for the hotel. The man was more like a meteorite to Caleb, about to hit a desolate planet, not just because of his gigantic form, but because he carried with his walking stick and trailing black cape an air of adventure and danger with him, danger of the darkest kind. Caleb would not see this man again until the next evening, and when he did, it was just as if he himself had been hit by that meteor. He was so shocked to find him there. Before we get to that thrilling encounter, however, it's probably best if I fill you in on some of the details. You may be wondering, who is Caleb, and what was he doing there at this precise juncture of space and time and destiny? Was he alone, headed to work at the nation's largest train depot, Union Station, carrying luggage, or to the stables to tend the cabbies' horses? Great questions. Always good to ask, so keep it up. But no, Caleb was not off to work, nor was he alone. He walked along with his brother and sister after a short trolley ride from the nearby Barnes Hospital, where they had just left their ailing mother along with their forlorn father. The family had arrived in town late the previous night, so Mother could take advantage of a risky surgery aimed at saving her life. It being the feast of St. Joseph that day, their father saw this as a good sign, and it was all the two boys could do to show that they shared his confidence earlier, while the family unit huddled in that cramped, antiseptic-smelling room together. So when his younger sister Gilda shouted, "Let's play tag," and darted to a lamppost to use it as a base of operations, Caleb did not react favorably as he normally would. He opened his mouth with a scowl to respond, but Jacob, his older brother, by 2 years, beat him to it. "Not now, Gilly. Mother could die. It's not a time for games." G.K. Chesterton, the man whom Caleb saw stepping from his cab to enter the Hotel Statler, after guiding his wife Frances along with him, would definitely have disagreed with that statement. Games, the young boy would find out, were to Chesterton as the sun's rays to soil. "Go on and be sad," Gilda shouted back. "I refuse to. And you want to know why?" she asked, picking up a scrap of newspaper to ball in her hands. Neither brother had time to answer. She just threw the missile at them with all of her might and shouted, "Because I know she'll get better. I know it." That embarrassing thing happened next with the paper ball. You know how when there are two people to hit and you only have one thing to throw, it ends up going right between them? Well, this is what happened. Caleb reached out, though, to soften the humiliation, and the makeshift missile struck his hand and bounced upward right into Jacob's nose. He was not happy about this, at all. Caleb winced and braced for the retaliation, a punch in the arm or maybe a choke around the neck. Big brothers, you gotta love them, right? Some of you are nodding. Not all of you. Odd. The odd thing that happened next actually made Caleb's stomach sink further than it already had that day. His older brother just looked at him with a sad grin. "Let's go," he said. "I'm hungry." Jacob took off across the street. As they hurried after him, Caleb almost wished he had been pummeled by his brother. That would have meant things were normal, all right, that their world was not spinning out of orbit and heading into a black hole. He could still see his father's earth-browned and calloused hand clutching his mother's, his eyes filled with dread, lips moving in an almost constant prayer under his breath, and Mother, normally radiant and spirited, lying there like a wilting daisy, trying her best to open up for a moment and say with tremulous trust, "Everything will be all right. You'll see, children." Caleb reached a hand out now and tried to say the same thing to Gilda, only with his 5 fingers as he gripped his 10-year-old sister's hand and pulled her along. It will be all right. They spent 30 cents on breakfast, highway robbery as Jacob called it, and after wandering around the town known as the Gateway to the West, but to them seeming like nothing more than red brick buildings of business with little fun to offer, they did the only natural thing, following a stop in the church to say a prayer for Mother. They went to play tag at Union Station. The place was quite a sight to see, and true, they had seen it already, but it had been late at night, and they could only sense its magnitude then, much like walking along an ocean shore in the pitch moonless black. It was touted as the largest train station in the country at its inauguration, with 10 acres allocated for its train shed alone. The kids, however, cared little for watching locomotives that day, having seen plenty on their trip from the town of Moberly, passing through Columbia and stopping for a spell at Jefferson City. Now they had the enormous gold-leafed Hall of Travelers as their domain, with its glorious domed arches, Romanesque to be exact, booths of all kinds, and terraces for sojourners tucked high like balconies in a theater. They spent nearly the entire day there, Jacob reading newspapers and acting much older than his age in Caleb's opinion, while the 2 younger kids ran and played and pretended they were spies at one point or refugees of war. This was Gilda's idea, or the usual, cops and robbers. Much to their dismay, and on their return to the hospital, they learned the operation had been delayed one more day because their mother was deemed too weak from travel. "I would like to go see this man," Jacob said, showing a newspaper clipping to his father and mother, as Caleb watched, in the middle of a game of Old Maid with Gilda. The ad read, G.K. Chesterton, in bold letters, and then said, "World-famous literary genius will lecture on the ignorance of the educated." How could he be so selfish? Caleb thought to himself as he eyed his elder with a judgmental squint, ignoring the assistance of his sister to pick, as she held up her 2 remaining cards. Much to his surprise, though, Mother and Father thought it a good idea, even with the price of admission at $2 apiece. Maybe it would be a good distraction. Little did they know this decision would change Caleb's life forever. Now, he did not know this at the time. He was mostly mad he would have to sit through some boring talk on what may be their last night in the city. He reached out and picked a card. It was the silver-haired old maid with her knitting needles, of course. The next day they went to Mass, and it was Palm Sunday, so the church was packed and hot, the gospel extra long, and the kids anxious. Caleb had never known his father to miss a Sunday, unless terribly ill. Yet the man remained behind with Mother, assured that a priest would come by with communion for them both at some point before her surgery. They had to go through the heartbreaking agony of saying goodbye again, amid smells of chloroseptic and fresh linen, and at 5 p.m. their mother had to be taken away to prepare for surgery on a gurney, its left back wheel shaking much like Caleb's heart shook, watching her receding down the hall all the way until she turned a cold corner. Father sighed and looked at his 3 children, grays looking grayer, lines on his face deeper. Dinner was all he could muster the energy to say. Daniel Travers treated his somber trio of offspring to a meal none of them enjoyed, though he devoured his quarter-house and potatoes ravenously. He hardly seemed to notice the food as it went down, though, and when they parted ways at 7 o'clock, since the talk was set to start at 8:15, the man seemed to stare right through them. He commended the youngers to the elder, and then turned to walk back to the hospital. One of the many surprises in store for Caleb that night, after realizing Gilbert Keith Chesterton was the same monumental figure he had seen in the street a day prior, was that this massive genius, as the paper called him, was actually quite funny. Nearly 500 people crammed into the sold-out Sheldon Auditorium, named for the late founder of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, while Gilda fell asleep in Jacob's arms shortly after the speaker promised he was not going to lecture for long, saying, "Brevity is an excellent substitute for wit." Caleb could see his brother chuckle along with the rest of the audience at many points. even though he thought Jacob took himself far too seriously lately and tried very hard to let everyone know about it. Jacob also tried, it seemed, to not let any opportunity go to waste in letting Caleb know just how far below him he ranked on the scales of intelligence and pretty much every other attribute, like strength, honor, athletic prowess, and so on. When Chesterton said the profound statement that something is almost always lost by the greatest technological gains, Caleb nodded along with the crowd, but soon felt a sharp elbow to his arm from his brother, who whispered, "Don't pretend to know what that means." Younger brother just folded his arms and firmly resolved to listen even more intently at this point. Yet Chesterton himself seemed distracted. Looking their way in the large crowd, it was almost as if he had caught the interchange between the rival siblings. No, that couldn't be, Caleb thought. But he was wrong, more wrong than he could ever know. The speaker found his place and went on to describe a fictitiously satirical situation where social scientists visited a crowded part of St. Louis and determined that nothing but bad could come from such cramping. "Seriously, however, I do not approve of these great industrial centers," Chesterton added. "And I think it quite unlikely that unless our industrial capitalism is broken up, our civilization may go to smash." Now, you may be totally lost at this point, like Caleb, though he would not admit it, but older brother Jacob made some grunts, as likely your parent did listening to such a prophetic statement, and Caleb made an important decision at this moment. He decided he would make life a little more difficult for Jacob at the closing of the night, just for spite. Not at all because his brother had been right. After the thunderous applause, interrupted for a time by a lengthy interview where the speaker answered many lively questions from the audience with lots of charm, charity, and chortles, Caleb went to the outhouse and then obstinately remained out. If he waited there for a short time, he knew, it would be like an eternity to Jacob, who was in charge of him and would most likely worry. So Caleb waited longer and longer. It had become a brisk night, and he was just buttoning up his corduroy jacket when the lamplight became totally blocked for a moment in the alley behind the auditorium. Caleb looked up, and to his utmost surprise, the speaker from the stage stood there, catching his breath as he caught up his walking stick on entering the alley. Normally, Caleb would have just turned and gone back inside. Adults generally did not take notice of him, and especially not famous ones. The closest he had gotten to one was President Harding at a rally before his recent election, and being neither a baby nor a widow or wealthy landowner, young Caleb had indeed been ignored. But Caleb found himself frozen to the spot now, and for good reason. This man's eyes were fixed directly on him, the eyes of the great author G.K. Chesterton, as the rear door of the building thundered shut. He leaned down like a mountaintop, speaking to a grasshopper in a valley, and said in a deeper voice than the one he used on stage, "I need you for a mission, young man. Are you up for it?" Caleb looked at the moon of a man in astonishment, and could only ask, What mission, sir?" The speaker seemed to ignore the question. He looked over his shoulder at the nearby bustle of people in the street, and then fierce eyes blazed back at the boy. "Meet me in the rear stairwell of the Half-Crest Hotel at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, and bring your brother with you." I, Caleb stammered, but then grabbed hold of something deep inside of him that resembled courage, though it was more likely anger if he were to be honest with himself. He raised both his hands and blurted, "Look, I won't move a muscle unless you tell me plain and clear what sort of mission." "Why, the best sort, of course," the man bellowed now, despite himself. Then G.K. added with a boyish grin, "The sort that saves the world." End of chapter 1.